If you had enough power to get away with anything, would you still be good? Don't answer too quickly, because that's the lie we tell ourselves, that we're different, that we'd never cross the line. But power is a funny thing. It doesn't change you, it reveals you. At Gracefield High, 5 boys had everything: money, influence, untouchable last names. They learned young that rules were just illusions, that consequences were for the weak, until the night everything fell apart. A crime too big to hide, a secret too dangerous to keep, a witness who saw too much. Now the world thinks justice has been served. But here's the real question. Did the untouchables fall? Or did they just make room for someone even worse? Because power never disappears. It only changes hands. Listen closely, because once you start, you won't be able to stop. Part 1. The Rise of the Untouchables. A warning. A woman sat in her small apartment typing on her laptop. She was a journalist, writing about the biggest school scandal in the country. On her screen were 2 pictures. The first showed 5 boys in handcuffs, their faces pale with fear. The second showed a boy who would never smile again. He was gone because of the 5 boys. Everyone says justice was served, that the untouchables got what they deserved. But will this really stop the next group from rising? She sighed, looking out of her window. The city lights were bright, but somewhere in the darkness, another child was learning the wrong lesson. Money can protect you from punishment. She started typing again. To understand how they fell, we must first understand how they rose. Gracefield High was not a normal school. It was a school for the rich. Here, money was more important than rules. Students didn't just study, they controlled everything. Teachers were careful with their words. If they punished the wrong student, they could lose their job. Among all the students, 5 boys were the most powerful. People called them the untouchables because no one could punish them. They had different last names, but they all came from wealthy families. Jide, David, Toby, Sagan, Chris. They could do whatever they wanted, and nobody could stop them. Jide was the first to learn the truth. At 13, he pushed a younger boy's head into the toilet for spilling juice on his shoes. The boy reported it, hoping for justice. The next day, the boy was gone. His father worked for Jide's father and didn't want to lose his job. Jide laughed. "See," he told his friends, "people fear money more than anything else." And from that moment, the 5 boys knew. If you had power, you could do anything. The teachers at Gracefield High were not bad people, but they had given up. They knew that if they tried to discipline certain students, they would get fired. One day, Mr. Hassan, an honest teacher, took David's phone because he was playing music in class. The next morning, the principal gave Mr. Hassan a warning letter. "David's father is angry," the principal said. "If we don't return the phone, he will stop giving money to the school." Mr. Hassan wanted to argue, but he knew the truth. "If I fight back, I will lose my job." He walked away in silence, and the boys learned another lesson. Even teachers are afraid of us. Not all students at Gracefield High were rich. Some were there on scholarships. They knew the untouchables were dangerous. They knew that if they reported them, nothing would happen. So they stayed silent. But deep inside, they also knew something else. One day, they will make a mistake. And when that day came, they would finally fall. It wasn't just the school that created the untouchables. It was their parents. Jide's father always said, "A real man doesn't get caught. If you must break rules, Make sure you control the game. David's mother always defended him. He's just a boy. Boys make mistakes. Toby's father never talked to him much, but he always sent money. Money solves everything, son. And the boys believed their parents. They didn't know that true love isn't about giving everything a child wants. It's about giving them what they need. Discipline. One night, a student named Karidi went missing for 3 hours. His friends found him behind the cafeteria, shaking and crying. Nobody knew what the untouchables had done to him. But the next day, his parents removed him from the school. The principal was relieved. If there's no complaint, there's no problem. And the untouchables learned a new lesson. Even when people know what we did, if they're too scared to speak, it never happened. But what they didn't know was this. Every crime leaves a witness, even if the witness is silence. There was one student nobody noticed, a boy who had been watching, listening, and remembering every bad thing the untouchables had done. His name was Femi. He wasn't rich, he wasn't powerful, but he had something the untouchables didn't have: patience. He was waiting for them to make a mistake, because when they did, he would be ready. The story has begun. The fall is coming. But how far will they go before it happens? Part 2. The prank that became a crime. When a storm is coming, the sky is always calm. No empire falls in one day. It starts slowly, a crack in the foundation, a small mistake, a moment that feels harmless. Then suddenly, everything collapses. The untouchables didn't just destroy themselves in one night. They were already falling. They just didn't know it yet. And by the time they realized, it was too late. But let's go back to the beginning, to the moment the first crack appeared, to the moment the walls started to shake, to the first domino. Before they all crashed down, it started as a joke, a harmless game. Sagoon had stolen a bottle of ethanol from the chemistry lab, laughing as he showed it to the others. "Let's burn something," Chris said. They were in an empty classroom after school. Jide flicked a lighter. The blue flame danced in the air. They poured a little ethanol on a notebook and lit it. A small fire, just for fun. But then Chris grabbed the bottle and poured more. The fire jumped onto the curtains. In seconds, the whole room was burning. They panicked. David grabbed a bucket of water and threw it. Boom. The flames exploded bigger. They ran. By the time the fire was put out, half the classroom was destroyed. The school was furious. The principal was shouting. But by the next morning, the official announcement was clear. It was an accident. The untouchables were safe. Again. They laughed about it the next day. They didn't know they had just started a chain reaction. Karide had seen them that night. He was walking past the classroom when he heard the laughter. He saw the flames. The next morning, when the school called it an accident, he knew the truth, and he made a mistake. He told Femi. "It wasn't an accident," Karidi whispered. "I saw them." Femi's hands clenched into fists. "Then we should report them." Karidi hesitated. "You know what they do to people who talk." But Femi was different. He wasn't afraid anymore. He went to the principal's office. He knocked. The door opened. And there, sitting in front of the principal's desk, was Jide's father, staring at him. The principal's voice was cold. "Go back to class, Femi." Femi's mouth went dry. He understood. There was no justice here. Karidi had been right. And that night, Karidi disappeared for 3 hours. When he was found behind the cafeteria, shaking and silent, Femi knew he had made a mistake. But he wouldn't make it again. This time he wouldn't go to the principal. This time he would be smarter. This time he would wait. Because he knew something the untouchables didn't. Power makes you reckless, and reckless people always make mistakes. Jide had already decided who was going to be the head boy, and it wasn't Daniel. Daniel was smart, too smart. He was the only student who ever stood up to the untouchables. So when the election came, they didn't take chances. David hacked the voting system. Chris spread rumors about Daniel. Sagan stole his exam papers and replaced them with blank ones. The next day, the principal called Daniel into the office. "We have to disqualify you," she said. "You failed your exams." Daniel's hands shook. "That's impossible." The principal sighed. "I'm sorry." Daniel didn't fight back. He just nodded and walked out. By the next week, he had left the school. The untouchables laughed. Another enemy gone. They had won, or so they thought, because they didn't know. Daniel had gone straight to the Ministry of Education, and the ministry had started an investigation. It wasn't public yet, but it was coming. The walls were already shaking, and the boys had no idea. Inspection day. The school was quiet. The visitors were important people. The untouchables wanted to ruin it. "Let's pull the fire alarm," Jide grinned. "Make the whole school panic." They thought it was harmless. They thought it was funny. They didn't know that in the clinic, a student was on oxygen. They didn't know that when the nurses heard the alarm, they would run out. They didn't know that when they came back, the boy would be dead. The school gathered outside in confusion. The untouchables stood back laughing. Then suddenly, a scream, teachers running. "A boy in the clinic, he's not breathing." Everything stopped. Jide felt his stomach turn. No way. Minutes later, an ambulance arrived. The paramedics checked the boy. They shook their heads. Dead on arrival. The air was silent. Then, "Who pulled the fire alarm?" A voice. Femi stepped forward. He pointed straight at them. They did. The untouchables froze. It was over. They could feel it. Then, the principal cleared his throat. "This is a tragedy," he said, "but we will handle this quietly." The school board covered it up. The death certificate said, "Natural causes." No police, no media. Nothing happened. The untouchables walked away. Again. They thought they had won. They thought they had escaped. They thought their power was still unbreakable. But that night, as they celebrated, a letter arrived at the school from the Ministry of Education. And inside, it said just one thing. "We are reopening the case of Daniel Adeyemi's rigged election. Officials will arrive next week." The untouchables had no idea. They were laughing, drinking, feeling invincible, and they didn't see it coming, not until it was too late. They thought the danger was over. They thought they had escaped, but the walls were already falling. And in part 3, the real nightmare begins. The next part will change everything. Are you ready? Part 3, the trial of the century, where power crumbles and the truth is unforgiving. When the walls fall, everyone inside gets buried. Power is like a house built on lies. For years, the untouchables had built a fortress around themselves, protected by wealth, fear, and influence. And for years, the people around them had helped build that fortress. Their parents, their teachers, the school. But now, the walls were cracking. The fire alarm prank was supposed to be the biggest mistake, but it wasn't. The real mistake had already happened before that. The moment their parents decided that money was more important than discipline. The moment the teachers chose silence over justice. The moment the school became a business, not a place of learning. And now everyone would pay the price. The letter arrived at 10 a.m. The Ministry of Education was reopening the case of Daniel Adeyemi's rigged election. They were sending officials to investigate. The principal's hands trembled as he read it, because he knew if they found out about the rigged election, they would find out about everything else: the bullying, the fire, the bribery, the cover-ups, and the death of the boy in the clinic. This wasn't just about the untouchables anymore. It was about the entire school. And the school wasn't ready. By noon, the news had reached the parents of the untouchables. There was panic, emergency phone calls, secret meetings. 5 powerful families sat around a long glass table in a private office. Jaid's father, a billionaire businessman. David's mother, a government official. Toby's father, an oil tycoon. Segun's uncle, a senator. Chris's mother, a famous lawyer. They were used to solving problems with money. "How bad is this?" David's mother asked. "Very bad," Chris's mother sighed. "They are sending investigators. If they dig too deep, they will find other things." She didn't say what the other things were, but they all knew. They had covered up their son's crimes for years. And if the truth came out, it wouldn't just be the boys going to jail. They could all lose everything. "We have to control this," Jaid's father said, "before it's too late." But what if it already was? Let's pause for a moment. Let's ask the question no one ever asks parents like these. When you gave your child everything, did you ever stop to ask if you were giving them what they actually needed? Because here's the truth. A child needs love. A child needs education. A child needs discipline. Money can buy them comfort, but money can't buy them wisdom. Money can save them from small mistakes, but money can't save them from themselves. And now, these parents were about to learn that lesson the hard way, because no matter how much money they had, no amount of money could bring back the dead. The Ministry of Education arrived the next morning. They didn't come alone. They brought the media and the police. Students whispered. Teachers stared in shock. For the first time in Gracefield High's history, the school was under investigation. The principal tried to keep it under control. "We are happy to cooperate," she smiled, sweat dripping down her face. But behind the smile, she was terrified, because she knew if they found out everything, her career was over, her life was over. And when they started questioning students, the real horror began. For years, the students of Gracefield High had been silent. But now they had a chance to speak. And once they started talking, they did not stop. They talked about Khalid. They talked about Daniel. They talked about the bullying, the threats, the fear. And then they talked about the boy in the clinic, the one who never woke up, the one the school covered up. Gasps. Teachers exchanged glances. The principal turned pale, because the truth was finally out, and there was no stopping it. Jaid's father stormed into the principal's office. "What nonsense is this? My son will not be treated like a criminal." The principal was sweating. "Sir, this is out of my hands now. The ministry." "I don't care about the ministry." But someone else spoke. A quiet voice. It was Femi. He stood at the door. "Sir," he said, "you have spent your whole life protecting your son from consequences. But did you ever stop to ask, what kind of man are you raising?" Silence. Femi stepped closer. "If your child is always right, if your child is always innocent, if your child can never be corrected, then you are not raising a child. You are raising a disaster." Jaid's father opened his mouth, but no words came out, because deep down, he knew Femi was right. But it was too late to change anything now. The media was outside, the police were waiting, the whole country was watching. And just when the untouchables thought it couldn't get worse, a police officer stepped forward. Everything became clear. This wasn't just about the boys. This was about the parents too. Bribery, corruption, cover-ups, extortion. For years, these families had done whatever it took to keep their sons protected. They had threatened, silenced, and paid their way out of consequences. And now, it was all laid out in black and white. The officers didn't ask for the boys first. They asked for the parents. Jaid's father stood up, rage flashing in his eyes. "You will not arrest me in front of my child." The officer's voice was calm. "No, sir. You will be arrested in front of the whole country." The media was already outside. Cameras were rolling. The world was watching. The untouchables had always believed they could do anything and walk away untouched. But now, they weren't the ones being dragged away first. They watched, shocked, as their own parents, the ones who had always saved them, always protected them, always made their problems disappear, were led away in handcuffs. For the first time in their lives, there was no one left to hide behind. And then, it was their turn. Jaid, David, Toby, Sagoon, Chris. One by one, they were called forward. The cuffs snapped around their wrists. Their classmates, the same ones who had once feared them, stood in silence, watching. No one cheered. No one laughed. Because in that moment, no one was thinking about revenge. They were all thinking one thing. How did it come to this? At what point does a child turn into a monster? At what point does a parent stop raising a son and start raising a disaster? How many times had these parents seen the signs and ignored them? How many times had teachers tried to correct them only to be silenced? How many times had their classmates wanted to speak but didn't because they knew it wouldn't matter? And now, in the cold silence of reality, the most painful question of all remained. If someone had stopped them earlier, would it have ever reached this point? The police van door slammed shut. The cameras flashed, and just like that, the untouchables were gone. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because now the real nightmare was about to begin. Because power is an illusion. And the moment you step into a world where money and influence don't matter, you realize you were never powerful to begin with. The untouchables had ruled Gracefield High. But in prison, they were just 5 scared boys who had never learned how to survive without their parents' money. And soon, they would learn what it really meant to be powerless.